Hello YouTube, this is Neon. Today I wanted to share on how I became fascinated with serial killers and horrified. Now, let me start off by saying that the vast majority of people who follow like serial killer documentaries, for example, they're not inspired by serial killers. They don't want to be a serial killer. They don't want to kill anybody, okay? But they are fascinated and horrified by them. But they don't want to. They don't want to kill anybody. Just like people who watch horror flicks don't want to kill people. Okay, so I had lived in Palm Springs in my late 20s with my boyfriend at that time. That relationship was my longest, and it lasted like maybe 11 months. What are you gonna do? He was fascinated with serial killers. So one day he told me something about some serial killer who would kill women, and I was like, ew, I don't want to know about that. It was just too frightening, knowing that side of humanity. So we broke up, he left me, and he had left this encyclopedia of serial killers that somehow it was in my vehicle. I had a vehicle back then, and I was browsing through it. I don't know if my intention was to bring it back to him or what was the intention, because he was gone. He was long gone. He moved back in with his sort of adopted stepdad, you might say. And so I started browsing through this encyclopedia of serial killers. It was similar in size to this dictionary, and it was really thick. It was a little bit bigger though in terms of the size of the book. It was a paperback. So as I'm reading through, I guess the front, and I'm reading sort of the names of different serial killers that this dictionary covers, I begin to see women's names appear. I see the Damsel of Death, Eileen Wuornos, the woman serial killer from Florida who had been executed. Monster, the movie Monster, was made based on her life and her killings. Incredible movie, starring Charlize Theron, who won the Oscar. And I began seeing other women. I think that at that time I didn't know that there was such thing as a woman serial killer. So I read all of the ones of women serial killers in this dictionary, and that sort of ended it. I don't think I read the men ones. So that kind of was where my curiosity began. I think for me it was just too crazy to think that there are women out there that are serial killers. So later on, as I got broke, I basically could only afford internet with my old laptop. So it was lots of YouTube, lots of documentaries. Eventually I got the courage to start watching documentaries about serial killers. And I'm going to expound about some of the things that I've learned about serial killers. Serial killers are Homo sapiens, and like all animals, there are certain patterns and predictabilities and whatnot associated with serial killers. One thing that was shocking was that there are a number of prolific gay serial killers. And these serial killers kill gay men, overwhelmingly. So that kind of hit home with me. Someone who's promiscuous, who has messed around with a lot of guys. And that can be the most common way that gay serial killers, and even straight serial killers, prey on gay men. One thing that they do is they look for men who are into bondage, who are not careful and will allow someone to bind them, who they don't know. That's been something that I can't say I've never done, but I've maybe done it twice, but something I've rarely done. And when And yes, men have asked me if they could bind me, and it's no, no. But that's one way that gay men have been killed by serial killers. Or it could be just that they get robbed and beat up. Never allow anybody to bind you who you don't know well, who your friends haven't met, who your family hasn't met. Some of the most shocking things about serial killers, 90% of male serial killers, it's a sexual thing. They find killing to be sexually a turn-on. That's very disturbing. The other 10%, you could say it's for fame. It's for fame. Most serial killers, it's a God complex. God of fire, hail, and brimstone. I'm not saying this correctly, but the angry God, okay? The idea that God can give life and that God can take away life. They're the God that takes away life. So they elevate themselves so far up above the people who they murder that it's like they're God. They have a God complex. It's very, very disturbing. Many men have recorded their killings, and it's so that they can pleasure themselves looking at these killings at a later date. I've never seen all of these recordings, but sometimes they'll show little clips during documentaries. Those clips have given me nightmares, to be honest. And those tend to be cleaned up versions, and sometimes it may only be part of the audio. And some of those have given me nightmares. It's just the reality of someone torturing, terrorizing, overwhelming, psychologically, emotionally, as well as physically, another human being, and just enjoying doing that. The suffering that the victim, that the person, the human being that's being victimized goes through has given me nightmares. One fascinating thing I found about serial killers is that once they've killed so many people, and that number can vary to where they get bored killing. It's not as sexually gratifying anymore. It's not as, it doesn't charge them emotionally as much. And one could describe that they get good at killing, if you will. There's two things. One, sometimes they get sloppy because they've killed so many people, and their sloppiness is what ultimately gets them caught. Another thing about that is that some of them will get themselves caught because now they want fame. I believe the media has become wise to this, but when there's the main story of the news is a serial killer, and he or she is watching the news, and they know that they're the ones who've caused all this. They're the ones that the media is talking about. They're the ones that people in a particular city or perhaps in a state are being warned by the media, by the newspapers, by the press, the TV press, to watch out, don't jog through parks, or don't, wherever would protect them. They know that they're the big bad wolf, and they like that power. So many who have killed so many people will then seek to get fame. Many have gotten themselves caught because either people weren't onto them, or they weren't seeing anything in the press, so they would discover a body. And one guy who had discovered a body, part of his semen was on the woman, and because of the weather conditions, her body did not decompose, and neither did the semen. And this was like 3 days later. So they were able to prove that he was the one who murdered this woman. and murdered a lot of women. There's quite a few serial killers that have gotten themselves caught by trying to play a role in it because they want fame, whether it's being the person that sort of played some kind of a role in the investigation, or trying to get it to where they're in the press, because not all serial killers wind up in the press. Not all people who are murdered are even reported missing in some cases, and not all murders by serial killers are necessarily recognized as being serial killings. They may be just recognized as individual killings. So some of these bored serial killers will give out some kind of a piece of information to get themselves, not to get themselves caught, but to get attention and fame. And they wind up getting themselves caught because they wrote a letter to a news agency, or they wrote a letter to, they made a phone call, or they went to the police to report something. And so that's pretty fascinating to me. The serial killer couples, whether it's lesbian couples, gay couples, straight couples who kill, they're fascinating. A lot of times they would not have been serial killers alone. It's sort of the coupling of these two evil minds that winds up bringing about all the killings. So that's what kind of made me fascinated by them. I guess you could say, once I wasn't so afraid of like looking at the documentaries, it became fascinating, quite honestly, and horrifying, as I said. So that's about it. That's how I became fascinated with serial killers. I don't watch them hardly anymore. Most I've seen already, and I think that the era of the serial killer it's sort of over. They make the news after they catch them. The news typically doesn't make them the main story anymore, which I think is a good thing, because I don't think they deserve that kind of attention, which is what they want after they've killed so many people. But most of what I've seen on YouTube, I've seen already. You know, gay, straight, lesbian couples. I've seen most serial killers, and I've seen the stories of serial killers from all over the world, by the way. And they exist all over. The Ukraine, Russia, the UK, South Africa, the Philippines, Indonesia, Mexico, South America, Colombia. There's serial killers, Australia. There's serial killers probably in every country of the world, Spain. And so it is very, very fascinating. It's interesting that a lot of countries are like, oh, that's something that happens in the U.S. or African Americans. That's something that white people do. And unfortunately, it happens in every community, every race, gender orientation, every sphere it exists. And to the extent that we say, oh, that happens over there, not within our community, we sort of make our communities vulnerable. Which is why, like in Russia, some serial killers have gotten away with numerous murders, because they didn't really even want to acknowledge that they had serial killers in these countries. That was a Western thing. Well, they are part of the West, but that was a capitalist thing. That's also something that's pretty fascinating about serial killers. They exist all over. And I remember seeing a serial killer, a story, Rob Dyke, I believe, covered it. They called him the Atlanta Ripper. And he was an African-American serial killer who killed African-American women, which is most often the case. They tend to kill members of their own race or their own gender, sexual orientation, or whatever. And he was African-American, and this was 1910s, and they never caught him. So, you know, they've always existed. If you like my video or find it interesting, please like, subscribe, share, comment, commercials, recommend my videos. Do one of those things. Thank you and best wishes.